After my husband died, my daughter abandoned me in the countryside. She thought my story ended there, but that was only the beginning. I had been married for 42 years when my husband died. 42 years of shared mornings, quiet routines, and a life built brick by brick. He was not a perfect man, but he was my home. When people talk about losing someone, they often speak of absence. What they don't explain is how the world itself seems to tilt. How the air feels heavier. How silence becomes loud enough to hurt. He passed away on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind that feels unfinished. A short illness, the doctors said. One moment, he was complaining about the bitter tea at the hospital. The next, he was gone. I remember holding his hand as it grew cold, whispering his name, waiting for him to squeeze back the way he always did. He never did. The days after the funeral blurred together. Condolences came and went. Flowers wilted. The house, once full of his voice and footsteps, felt too big and unbearably empty. At night, I reached across the bed without thinking, my hand finding only cold sheets. That was when the grief truly settled in. Through it all, I told myself one thing. At least I still have my daughter. She was my only child, the person I had poured my life into. I believed, without question, that she would be my anchor now, the way I had once been hers, in those early days. She visited often. She brought groceries, spoke gently, hugged me a little longer than usual. I mistook her efficiency for care, her distance for strength. But grief makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability makes you slow to notice changes. Little things began to shift. Her visits grew shorter. Her phone calls felt rushed. When I cried, she grew uncomfortable, glancing at her watch, telling me I needed to be strong and move forward. I tried. For her, for myself, for the memory of the man I loved. I sold nothing. I changed nothing. His shoes still waited by the door. His coat still hung in the hallway. I wasn't ready to erase him. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table. She avoided my eyes, stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved. "Mom," she said carefully, "this house? It's too much for you now." I laughed softly, thinking she was worried about my health. "I've lived here my whole life," I replied. "I'll be fine." She sighed. "I think it would be better if you stayed somewhere quieter. The countryside. Uncle's old place is empty. Fresh air, fewer worries." I didn't understand the tightness in my chest then. I didn't hear the unspoken words. I only heard my daughter offering a solution, and I trusted her, because she was my daughter. What I didn't know was that this conversation was not about helping me heal. It was about removing me, and I had no idea how completely my life was about to change. At first, I believed my daughter's suggestion came from love. That is what mothers do. We soften the sharp edges of our children's actions, so we don't have to face the truth. I told myself she was worried about me being alone in such a big house. I told myself the countryside would be peaceful, even healing. I repeated these thoughts until they sounded convincing. But trust, once given freely, can blind you. The days after that conversation passed in uneasy silence. My daughter did not ask how I felt about leaving the home I had shared with her father for decades. She did not ask what memories I wanted to keep close. Instead, she began making plans on my behalf. She spoke of logistics, not emotions, boxes, transportation, what I wouldn't need anymore. "I'll come by this weekend," she said over the phone one afternoon. "We should start sorting things. Sorting things. As if my life could be neatly divided into piles of keep and discard." When she arrived, she didn't come alone. She brought cardboard boxes, thick black trash bags, and a sense of urgency that made my chest ache. She moved through the house with quick, decisive steps, opening drawers, glancing into closets, mentally claiming space that no longer belonged to her. "You don't need all of this, Mom," she said, lifting one of my husband's old sweaters. "It's just going to make you sad." I reached for it instinctively. "Please," I whispered, "let me decide." She paused, annoyed, then placed it back with a sigh. "I'm just trying to help." But help doesn't feel like being erased. As the hours passed, I noticed how little she asked and how much she instructed. The house became unfamiliar, transformed into an obstacle she needed to clear. My memories were inconveniences. My grief, an inconvenience. And I, slow, emotional, resistant, I was the greatest inconvenience of all. That night, after she left, I sat alone on the living room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes. I held my husband's sweater against my face and breathed in what little of him remained. For the first time since his death, a different kind of fear crept in. The fear that I was no longer needed. The following week, she returned with her car already cleared out. "We'll take a few things today," she said brightly. "No rush, but it's better to start now." I wanted to say no. The word rose in my throat, heavy and desperate. But years of being a mother had trained me to swallow my needs. I nodded instead. The drive to the countryside was quiet. Fields stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, green and indifferent. My daughter hummed along to the radio, relaxed, while I stared out the window, clutching my purse like a lifeline. When we arrived, the house stood alone at the edge of a dirt road. It was smaller than I remembered, older, and clearly unlived in for years. Dust coated the windows. The air smelled of damp wood and abandonment. "It's not much," she said quickly, opening the door. "But it's temporary." Temporary. That word gave me comfort, though I would later realize it was never meant to be true. Inside, the house echoed. There was a bed, a table, and little else. No photographs. No warmth. No history. She carried in my suitcase and a box of essentials. Clothes, toiletries, medication. Nothing personal, nothing sentimental. "This should be enough for now," she said, setting it down. I looked around slowly. "When will you come back?" I asked. She hesitated just for a second. "Soon. I'm busy, but I'll call." She kissed my cheek near the door. It felt rushed, obligatory. Then she stepped outside, her keys already in her hand. I followed her onto the porch. "You're not staying?" I asked, my voice thin. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, you'll be fine. You always are." Then she got into her car. I stood there as the engine started. As gravel crunched beneath the tires, as the dust rose into the air and settled back onto the quiet road, I waited for her to stop, to wave, to turn around. She didn't. That night, the silence was unbearable. The countryside, which she had promised would be peaceful, felt vast and hostile. Every sound, the wind through the trees, the creaking of the house, felt like a reminder of how alone I was. I called her the next morning. No answer. I called again in the afternoon. Straight to voicemail. Days passed, then weeks. Her calls stopped entirely. When I finally understood that this was not a temporary arrangement, something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I had lost my husband to death. I had lost my daughter to choice. And that realization hurt far more than I was prepared to survive. Yet, in the quiet of that forgotten house, as the dust settled and the days stretched endlessly ahead, a truth began to form. Slow, painful, and undeniable. She had left me there to fade away. But fate, as I would soon learn, had other plans. The first morning, I woke up alone in the countryside. I didn't recognize where I was. For a few disoriented seconds, I reached for my husband, expecting to feel his familiar warmth beside me. Instead, my hand met cold air and an unfamiliar mattress. The realization came rushing back all at once. My husband was gone, my daughter was gone, and I was somewhere I did not choose to be. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. In the city, even loneliness had background noise. Cars, voices, life continuing just beyond the walls. Here, the silence pressed in from every direction. I sat up slowly, my joints aching, and listened to the distant sound of birds. Their songs were not comforting. They were reminders that the world was awake, while I felt left behind. The kitchen offered little relief. The refrigerator hummed softly, nearly empty, except for a few items my daughter had left behind. I made myself tea and drank it standing by the window, staring out at the fields that stretched endlessly beyond the property. They were beautiful, I supposed, but beauty means little when there is no one to share it with. Each day began to follow the same pattern. I woke early, not because I wanted to, but because sleep refused to stay with me. Memories crept in during the quiet hours. My husband, laughing at the breakfast table. My daughter, running through the yard as a child. By midday, the weight of those memories became too heavy, and I would sit down just to catch my breath. Simple tasks became challenges. Carrying water from the outdoor tap left my arms trembling. The old stove was temperamental, and I burned more meals than I cooked. At night, the darkness outside the windows felt thick and alive. I locked the door, even though I doubted anyone would come, and lay awake, listening to the house creak as if it, too, were settling into abandonment. I waited for my daughter's call. At first, I checked my phone constantly, convinced I must have missed it. I told myself she was busy, that she would call tomorrow. Then tomorrow came and went, and so did the next day. When I finally called her, the line rang until it disconnected. I left a message, careful to sound calm. Not needy. I'm fine, I said into the void, just checking in. She never responded. The realization that I had been forgotten didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, painfully, in the quiet moments between hope and disappointment. Each unanswered call chipped away at my sense of worth. I began to wonder if I had done something wrong. Had I been too dependent, too emotional, too much? The neighbors noticed me eventually. A woman from a nearby house waved one afternoon as I struggled to carry groceries inside. She smiled kindly, but didn't stop. Another neighbor, an elderly man, nodded in passing, but said nothing. People here were polite, but distant. They had their own lives, their own routines. I was just another lonely figure in a forgotten house. There were days I didn't speak out loud at all. When I finally heard my own voice, it startled me. It sounded weak, unfamiliar. I caught my reflection in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair had gone gray faster than I remembered. Her eyes looked hollow, as if something essential had been drained away. My health began to suffer. I forgot to eat. I forgot to take my medication on time. There were moments when dizziness forced me to sit down wherever I stood. I told myself I was fine, because admitting otherwise meant admitting I truly had no one to help me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the fields, I sat on the porch and cried. Not loudly, not desperately, but quietly, the way people cry when they no longer expect comfort. I cried for my husband, for the life we had built, for the daughter I had lost while she was still alive. That was the lowest point, the moment when I believed my story was over. And yet, something strange happened in that emptiness. With no one left to rely on, I began to rely on myself. Not out of strength, but necessity. I learned the rhythms of the house. Which floorboard creaked, which window let in the cold. I started tending the small, overgrown garden, my hands trembling at first, then steadier with each passing day. The work gave my days shape, pulling weeds, watering plants, watching something respond to my care. It reminded me that I still existed, that my presence mattered, even if only to the soil beneath my feet. I began speaking to myself, then to the garden, then to the stray cat that appeared one morning and refused to leave. Its quiet companionship filled some of the silence. I fed it scraps and named it Hope, though I wasn't sure why. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fog inside me began to lift. I still felt abandoned. I still missed my husband, with an ache that never faded. But beneath the grief, something else stirred, an awareness that being forgotten did not mean being finished. My daughter believed she had left me to fade away. What she didn't know was that in the very place she had abandoned me, something was beginning to grow, and it would change everything. The change did not arrive with fanfare. There was no sudden miracle, no dramatic rescue. It came quietly, the way most real transformations do, through small moments that barely seem important at the time. It began with the garden. One morning, as I knelt in the dirt pulling weeds, I noticed a line of green shoots breaking through the soil where nothing had grown before. I stared at them for a long time, unsure why my chest felt tight. Then I realized it was because they were alive, because despite neglect, despite abandonment, something had chosen to grow. I returned to that spot every day. I watered it carefully, shielding the fragile leaves from the harsh sun. Watching them stretch upward gave my days a sense of purpose. I wasn't just passing time anymore. I was nurturing something. And in doing so, I was slowly nurturing myself. The second change came in the form of a letter. It arrived in the late afternoon, tucked into the rusted mailbox at the end of the dirt road. My name, written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting, caught my attention. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought it might be from my daughter. My hands trembled as I opened it. I sat on the porch and read it twice, then a third time. Someone had thought of me. The realization felt almost unreal. Margaret visited a week later. She arrived in a small, dusty car, stepping out with a cautious smile, as if afraid I might disappear if she blinked. We embraced awkwardly at first, then tightly, both of us crying without apology. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't ask about my daughter. She simply listened as I spoke. Really spoke. For the first time in months. About my husband. About the silence. About the fear of becoming invisible. "You're not invisible," she said firmly, taking my hands in hers. "You never were." Her visit cracked something open inside me. After she left, I realized how starved I had been for connection. Not pity, not obligation, but genuine presence. Soon after, I began to notice the world beyond my property. I walked farther down the road, past the neighboring fields, waving at people instead of avoiding their eyes. Some waved back. One stopped to talk. Another offered help fixing a broken fence. The countryside, once so hostile, began to soften. Then came the discovery that truly altered my path. While cleaning out a neglected storage shed behind the house, I found old documents belonging to my husband's uncle, the original owner of the property. Among them were land records, agreements, and an unfinished will. Curious, I contacted a local lawyer Margaret recommended. What I learned stunned me. The land surrounding the house, several acres of it, had never been officially transferred. Through a series of overlooked clauses and legal technicalities, it was now legally mine. Not just the house, but the fertile land my daughter had dismissed as useless and isolating. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt something close to excitement. With guidance from neighbors and help from Margaret, I began using the land. I expanded the garden, planted vegetables, raised a few chickens. I sold surplus produce at a small local market, unsure if anyone would buy from me. They did. People returned week after week, not just for the produce, but for conversation. They asked about my garden, my methods, my story. They treated me like someone with value, not a burden. The money was modest, but it was mine. Earned. Empowering. As my confidence grew, so did my independence. I fixed things myself. I made decisions without waiting for permission. The woman who once waited by the phone for her daughter's call now planned her days around her own needs and goals. Months passed. The house changed, too. Curtains replaced bare windows. Photographs returned to the walls, not just of my past, but of my present, of sunrises over the fields, of my first successful harvest, of Hope the cat, now fat and spoiled. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling abandoned. I was still hurt, still aware of my daughter's absence, but the pain no longer defined me. It became a scar, evidence of survival, not weakness. One evening, as I counted my earnings from the market, my phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, surprised not by the call, but by my own calm. My hands were steady. My heart did not race. I let it ring. When I finally answered, her voice sounded uncertain. "Mom?" she said, as if unsure I was still there. "Yes," I replied evenly. "I'm here." She told me she had been busy, that things were complicated. that she wanted to visit soon. I listened without interrupting, noticing how little her excuses affected me. When she finished, there was silence. "I didn't know how well you'd manage out there," she added hesitantly. I looked around my home, at the warm light, the thriving garden outside the window, the life I had built from nothing. "I'm managing just fine," I said. And for the first time since she had driven away, I understood the truth. Her abandonment had not ended my life. It had redirected it. And the best part of my story was still unfolding. After that phone call, something inside me shifted completely. Not because my daughter had reached out, but because I realized how little power her absence now held over me. I no longer measured my days by whether she called or thought of me. My life had quietly expanded beyond that narrow waiting space, and I was only just beginning to understand how much it had grown. The garden flourished as if responding to my renewed sense of purpose. Rows of vegetables stood tall and healthy, their leaves vibrant in the morning light. What began as a way to survive had become something closer to joy. I woke early, not from grief or anxiety anymore, but from anticipation. There was always something to tend, something to improve. Word spread quickly in the small community. People talked. They always do. "The woman at the edge of the road has the best tomatoes," someone said at the market. Another claimed my eggs tasted like the ones from their childhood. Compliments embarrassed me at first. I wasn't used to being seen, let alone admired. But slowly, I learned to accept them without shrinking. I began keeping careful records: expenses, profits, yields. Numbers had never interested me before, but now they represented independence. Each small sale reinforced a powerful truth. I was capable. I was contributing. I was no longer surviving off someone else's goodwill or patience. Margaret remained a constant presence. She visited often, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit with a cup of tea and talk about nothing at all. Through her, I met others. Women who had lost spouses, men who had started over late in life, people who understood that endings did not always mean failure. The countryside no longer felt isolating. It felt protective. There were challenges, of course. Storms ruined crops. One of the chickens fell ill. There were nights when loneliness crept back in, whispering old fears. But I faced those moments differently now. Instead of folding inward, I reached outward. I asked for help. And each time, help came. I started teaching others what I had learned. Simple gardening techniques, preserving food, managing small plots of land. The idea came unexpectedly, suggested by a neighbor who admired my work. "You should show people how you do this," she said. "You've got a gift." A gift. No one had called anything I did a gift in a very long time. The small workshops grew popular. People gathered on my land, laughing, sharing stories, working side by side. My home, once silent and forgotten, became a place of warmth and movement. I watched strangers become friends and felt a quiet pride I had never known before. And still, my daughter knew nothing. She called occasionally, always brief, always distant. She never asked about my life in detail. I realized she assumed nothing had changed, that I was still the same fragile woman she had left behind. I let her believe it, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed her validation. The secret growth was not just in the garden or the business. It was within me. I stood taller. I spoke with confidence. I made plans, real plans for the future. I updated my will, organized my finances, considered what kind of life I wanted to continue building. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork, I came across old documents from my husband, investments he had quietly maintained for years. With the help of a financial advisor, I discovered they were worth far more than I had ever imagined. Enough to secure my future comfortably. Enough to give me choices. I thought of my daughter then, not with anger, but with clarity. She had believed leaving me in the countryside meant leaving me powerless. She had mistaken distance for disappearance. Time passed. Seasons changed. My hair grew whiter. My hands grew stronger. The day my daughter finally announced she was coming to visit, her tone was casual, almost entitled. "I'll come by this weekend," she said. "I should check on you." Check on me? I looked out the window at my land, lush, productive, alive. I thought of the people who would be stopping by later that day, the commitments I had made, the life that depended on me. "You're welcome to visit," I replied calmly. "Just let me know what time." When I ended the call, I felt no anxiety, no resentment. Only a quiet certainty. She was coming back expecting to find the woman she had abandoned. What she would find instead was someone entirely different, someone she had never truly known. And the truth, when she finally saw it, would leave her unprepared for the strength, for the independence, and for the consequences of her choices. The garden outside swayed gently in the breeze, full and thriving. So was I. The morning my daughter was due to arrive, I woke before sunrise, not from nerves, but from habit. The house was quiet, steady, familiar. I brewed tea and stood by the window, watching the fields slowly come alive under the pale light. There was no tightness in my chest, no rehearsed speeches running through my mind. I felt grounded, as if my feet were firmly planted, not just on the floor, but in my own life. By mid-morning, the driveway was busy. Margaret arrived first, bringing bread she had baked that morning. Soon after, 2 neighbors came by to collect vegetables they had ordered. Laughter filled the yard. The smell of earth and fresh produce lingered in the air. When my daughter's car finally appeared at the end of the dirt road, I noticed it with the same calm awareness I might give to an approaching storm, alert but unafraid. She stepped out slowly, scanning the property as if she had taken a wrong turn. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. The once neglected land was now alive with movement and color. Rows of vegetables stretched across the fields. Chickens clucked nearby. People stood talking, working, smiling. She approached me hesitantly. "Mom," she said, uncertainty creeping into her voice. I smiled. "You're right on time." Her eyes flicked toward the others. "I didn't know you had company." "They're neighbors," I replied. "Friends." That word seemed to catch her off guard. We walked toward the house together. She trailed behind slightly, taking in the details, the fresh paint on the door, the flower boxes beneath the windows, the sense of order and care that had replaced neglect. Inside, she paused, absorbing the warmth of the space. The home no longer echoed. It breathed. Photographs lined the walls, some old, many new. She stopped in front of one showing me at the market, smiling beside a table, overflowing with produce. "What's this?" she asked. "My work." I said simply. She turned to me, eyes searching. You sell vegetables? And eggs. I teach workshops. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I didn't think you'd manage all this on your own. I didn't either, I admitted. But here we are. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where she had once told me the house was too much for me. I poured tea, noticing how her hands fidgeted now, how her confidence had faltered. I meant to check on you sooner, she said. Things got complicated. I nodded, waiting. I thought you'd want quiet, time to rest. Rest, I repeated gently, is different from being left behind. Silence settled between us. Not heavy, but honest. She finally looked at me. I didn't expect this, she said quietly. I thought you'd still be struggling. I met her gaze calmly. I was, for a long time. She swallowed. Why didn't you tell me? I considered the question carefully. You didn't ask. The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Her shoulders slumped. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen in her for years. Uncertainty. Vulnerability. The realization that her assumptions had been wrong. I thought you needed me, she said. I didn't realize you could build a life without me. I didn't realize it either, I said. But needing someone and being abandoned by them are two different things. She flinched as if struck. We talked for hours about my husband, about grief, about the months of silence. She tried to explain herself. Career pressure, emotional exhaustion, fear. I listened, not to excuse her actions, but to understand them. Understanding, I learned, does not erase hurt. Eventually, she asked the question I knew was coming. So, what happens now? She said softly. I looked around the kitchen, the heart of the life I had rebuilt. That depends, I replied, on what you're hoping for. She hesitated. I thought maybe I could help more, be around. Maybe we could talk about the property, the future. There it was. Not greed exactly, but expectation. I've already talked about the future, I said, with myself. Her eyes widened slightly. This land, this life, it exists because I was forced to stand on my own, I continued. I won't give that up, not again. She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of my words. I'm not closing the door, I said gently. But I'm not stepping back into the shadow either. When she left that evening, her goodbye was different, longer, quieter. There were no promises, no dramatic apologies, only the awareness that something fundamental had shifted between us. As her car disappeared down the road, I felt neither victory nor sorrow. Only peace. She had returned expecting weakness. Instead, she had met strength. And she would never look at me the same way again. After my daughter left, the house did not feel emptier. That was the first surprise. I had expected the familiar ache to return, the old loneliness to creep back into the corners of my chest. Instead, there was a calm stillness, the kind that follows a long storm. I realized then how far I had come, from waiting to be chosen to choosing myself. The shock, however, had not yet fully settled for either of us. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time, her voice was different, quieter, careful. She was no longer speaking as someone in control of the situation, but as someone trying to understand it. I can't stop thinking about everything, she said. About you. I listened without interrupting. I thought I was doing the right thing, she continued. I really did. I thought you'd fade quietly, that you wouldn't notice how long I was gone. There it was. The truth spoken aloud. I noticed, I said calmly. The silence on the other end of the line stretched. Then she exhaled shakily. You didn't fall apart the way I expected. No, I replied. I fell apart in my own way, and then I put myself back together. That was the moment the shock truly landed, for her. She began asking questions, real ones. How had I learned to manage the land? Who helped me? How was I paying for everything? Each answer unsettled her further, not because she disapproved, but because it forced her to confront a version of me she had never imagined. Capable, autonomous, resilient. You don't need me anymore, she said finally, her voice cracking. The words were not an accusation. They were a realization. I need myself, I answered gently, and I choose who else has a place in my life now. That conversation marked a turning point. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but reckoning. Over the following weeks, she visited again, this time without assumptions. She arrived without plans, without instructions. She asked before helping. She listened more than she spoke. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and she felt it. At the market one Saturday, she watched quietly as people greeted me by name. They asked for advice. They thanked me. She stood to the side, observing the respect in their eyes. The ease in my movements. I didn't know you were like this, she said later. I was always like this, I replied. I just didn't have space to show it. The shock deepened when legal realities entered the picture. During one of her visits, she casually mentioned inheritance planning, speaking as though it were a natural extension of her role as my daughter. I saw her freeze when I calmly explained that my affairs were already in order. I've updated my will, I told her. Everything is structured to support the life I've built here. She blinked. I assumed. I know what you assumed, I said softly. That was when she truly understood. Abandonment has consequences, even when forgiveness is possible. She didn't argue. She didn't demand explanations. She simply nodded, the weight of her choices settling visibly on her shoulders. For the first time, I saw remorse not as performance, but as discomfort. Raw, humbling, and unavoidable. I didn't think leaving would change things this much, she admitted. It changed everything, I said, for both of us. The weeks that followed were delicate. We spoke more often, but with new boundaries. She no longer expected immediate access to my time or my emotions. She waited. She respected my schedule. She learned slowly what it meant to approach me as an equal, not a responsibility. I learned something too. I learned that shock is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, unfolding slowly as assumptions crumble and reality takes their place. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she spoke without looking at me. I'm proud of you, she said. I smiled, not because I needed her approval, but because it felt genuine. I'm proud of me too, I replied. That sentence would have been unthinkable once. Now, it felt natural. The greatest shock of all was not that she saw me differently. It was that I did. I was no longer the woman who feared being left behind. I was the woman who had survived it, transformed by it, and emerged with a life defined not by loss, but by choice. And in that realization, I found a power no one could ever take from me again. The transformation of my life, the garden, the home, the independence I had fought so hard to build, wasn't just a quiet victory over circumstance. It was also the prelude to a choice I had long avoided. What to do with my daughter, now returned, now confronted with the reality of my strength, now standing before me in a world she thought she still controlled. For years I had believed that motherhood meant unconditional forgiveness. I had believed that blood ties demanded sacrifice, even at the cost of my dignity. But those years of abandonment had shown me something far more valuable. Love does not require erasure of self. Respect does not require surrender. And forgiveness, while powerful, is not the same as submission. It started one chilly morning, as we stood in the yard together. My daughter had been visiting more regularly now, but always cautiously, as though testing the boundaries of her mother's autonomy. She had apologized in small ways, quietly, never dramatically. The acknowledgments were brief but meaningful, and I noticed the change in her posture, the humility she had once lacked, the awareness of her own mistakes. "I didn't realize how much you had done," she said softly, almost as if afraid to speak the words aloud. "You mean what I've done for myself," I replied. "I had to. No one else would." Her silence was heavy with realization. She was beginning to see me not as someone fragile or dependent, but as a person fully capable of living and thriving without her. And that, more than anything else, was the shock she hadn't anticipated. I had the power now, not over her, but over my own life and the space she would occupy within it. And with power comes choice. I could welcome her completely, unconditionally, as though the past had never existed. I could set limits, creating a cautious bridge of reconciliation. Or I could keep her at a distance, letting the consequences of her abandonment linger in a way she could not ignore. For days, I considered my options. My heart ached not with anger, but with clarity. This was no longer about punishment. It was about integrity, about defining the life I had fought so hard to claim. When the day of decision came, we were in the kitchen, the same table where so much of my independence had been formed. She looked at me expectantly, her eyes wide with uncertainty, searching for the old mother she once knew. "Mom," she began, I want to be part of your life again. I want to help. I want to make up for what I didn't do before." I paused, studying her carefully. There was sincerity in her voice, but I could also sense the residual expectation, the unspoken belief that my life should adjust around her return. "Do you understand," I said slowly, "that my life is not the same as it was before?" "Yes," she whispered. "I see that now. And it cannot go back to that," I said. "I cannot live in the shadow of your choices or your absence. You left. I had to survive. I had to build something real, something lasting, on my own. I can't pretend that never happened." Tears welled in her eyes, not from anger, but from recognition. She had expected weakness, a woman who would collapse again under the weight of her departure. Instead, she faced a mother who had grown stronger, taller, unshakable in ways she hadn't imagined. I told her then what I had realized in the months of silence and labor. Forgiveness was not automatic. Love was not synonymous with dependence. Boundaries were necessary, not cruel. "I can choose to let you back in," I said, "but only on my terms. You will not control my life. You will not dictate my actions. You will respect the person I have become." If you can do that, we can rebuild something together." She nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the words. For the first time, she was not trying to mold me into the mother she remembered, but acknowledging the woman I had become. In the following weeks, we navigated this new dynamic. She offered help when asked. She participated in the garden and the workshops, but she never assumed authority. She listened more than she spoke, and I, for my part, welcomed her presence, not as a necessity, but as a choice. One afternoon, as we worked side by side planting new crops, she paused and looked around at the land we had cultivated together. "It's incredible," she said quietly. "I never imagined you could do all this." I smiled. "You never gave me the chance before." The honesty in that moment, simple, clear, and unflinching, cemented my choice. I could forgive her, but forgiveness did not erase her past. She had abandoned me, left me in a place where I had to fight for every bit of life and dignity. She would carry the weight of that knowledge with her, just as I carried the strength it had forced me to find. And yet, I allowed her back into my life, not as the person I had depended on, but as a daughter who had learned humility, a human capable of growth, and perhaps one day, of true respect. The true power of my choice was not in giving or withholding permission. It was in claiming my agency. I was no longer a woman defined by loss or betrayal. I was a woman who had endured both and emerged with clarity, independence, and the right to decide who shared her life. By the end of that summer, the landscape of my life had shifted completely. My daughter had returned, but the dynamics had changed. I had grown stronger, more self-assured, and no longer needed the validation that she once assumed she could withhold or grant. I had created a life that could thrive independently, and my choice, how to engage with her now, was made from that position of strength. And in that decision, I found peace. It was not the peace of forgetting or erasing the past. It was the peace of knowing I had survived betrayal, abandonment, and loss, and had turned them into something powerful. It was the peace of having the final say in my own story. I had chosen life, strength, and peace. 14.1 million people, unless the need was ever satisfied. 17.2 million people, and dignity over resentment. I had chosen boundaries, independence, and clarity over dependency. And my daughter, for all her mistakes, had the opportunity to witness what true resilience looks like, and to step into that new reality not as a controller of my life, but as someone learning to respect it. For the first time in years, I understood that the most profound lessons of motherhood do not always come from giving unconditionally, but from teaching through action, integrity, and when necessary, firm choices. That day, I looked out over the land, the garden in full bloom, the house alive with activity, and realized my story was no longer defined by loss or abandonment. It was defined by strength, by choice, and by the life I had forged, entirely on my own terms. And in that realization, I was free. The days following my daughter's return were unlike anything I had experienced since my husband passed away. The air seemed lighter, the mornings warmer, and even the work that once felt like survival now carried a sense of purpose and pride. I had built more than a home and a garden. I had built a life, one that belonged entirely to me, and now I could choose who would share it. I woke each morning to the soft sunlight spilling across the fields, the garden, once wild and unkempt, now stood in perfect rows, vibrant with life. Tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, cucumbers stretched along the trellises, and the chickens clucked as they pecked in the dirt. The land, which had seemed so lonely and isolating when my daughter abandoned me, now pulsed with energy, as if it had been waiting for me to claim it. I began each day with a ritual, watering, tending, inspecting, and it grounded me. I no longer woke in panic or despair, fearing what the day might bring. Now the work itself reminded me of my strength. Each plant that thrived under my care became a symbol of survival. Each small success reminded me that I was capable, resilient, and deserving of life beyond grief. My daughter watched me carefully during these days. She no longer spoke as if she had authority over me, nor did she expect obedience. She asked questions, offered help when I invited it, and observed quietly. There was humility in her presence now, a recognition of the life she had underestimated. One afternoon, as we prepared baskets of produce for the market, she paused and looked at me. "Mom," she said softly, "I never realized you could do all this. I mean, without me." I smiled, brushing dirt from my hands. I had to, because no one else would do it for me, not even you. Her eyes brimmed with tears, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or bitterness. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The lesson had been learned, not through words, but through living proof. The woman she left behind had not just survived, she had flourished. Weeks turned into months. I established a small routine at the market, setting up my stall early and watching customers arrive. People came for my produce, for my advice, for the warmth of a woman who had created life from hardship. Some stayed to chat, some returned week after week, and I found myself forming a community, a support system I had never imagined possible. In this life, I was no longer invisible. I had earned recognition, respect, and a voice that carried weight. Even the house transformed with time. What had been bare and lonely became warm and inviting. Curtains swayed in the breeze, photographs lined the walls, and my favorite books occupied their rightful place on the shelves. The house had been my sanctuary, and now it had become my home in the truest sense, alive, filled with laughter, conversation, and life. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the horizon. My daughter approached cautiously, carrying a basket of vegetables she had helped harvest. She didn't speak at first. She simply set the basket down and joined me, letting the quiet settle between us. "I've learned a lot," she said finally. "About you, about life, about myself." I looked at her, taking in the lines of worry that had softened, the humility that had replaced entitlement. "I've learned a lot too," I said. "I've learned that life doesn't end when people leave you behind. And I've learned that the people who matter will arrive, not always when you expect, but in time." She nodded. "I don't expect you to need me. I just want to be part of your life. If you'll let me." I reached out and held her hand gently. "You can be part of my life, yes, but you must understand that it will be on my terms, not yours. I have built this life, and I will not compromise it to make anyone comfortable, least of all someone who once abandoned me." She squeezed my hand, and I felt the weight of her understanding. The lesson had finally settled. She had confronted the consequences of her actions, And now she had a chance to witness what resilience truly looks like. The new life I had built extended beyond the physical. My mind, once clouded with grief and fear, had found clarity. I planned for the future with confidence, considering new projects on the land, workshops, and even small expansions of the garden. I had money of my own, a network of friends and neighbors, and a sense of independence that no one could take away. The community I had formed also became a source of joy. People who once regarded me with curiosity now treated me with respect. Children played in the garden, neighbors stopped by for advice or conversation, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. I was no longer just surviving. I was living fully. And through it all, my daughter remained by my side, learning what it meant to approach life and relationships with respect, humility, and patience. She had returned to witness the life she had assumed was broken, only to discover that it had grown stronger in her absence. Months passed, and seasons shifted. Spring gave way to summer, summer to fall, and with each passing day, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The house, the garden, and the community had become symbols of resilience, proof that even in the aftermath of loss, life could thrive. One morning, I stood at the edge of the property, surveying the fields. The garden was full, the chickens roaming freely, the sun warm on my back. My daughter stood beside me, watching quietly. I realized then that my life had truly begun anew. The past, the loss of my husband, the abandonment by my daughter, would always remain a part of me. But it no longer defined me. It had been the catalyst for growth, the fire that had forged strength, independence, and clarity. I had been left behind, but in being left, I had discovered my own power. My daughter looked at me and smiled. There was no guilt, no expectation, only a shared understanding that life could be rebuilt and relationships could evolve if approached with honesty and respect. I returned the smile, feeling the truth of it deep in my bones. This was not the life I had planned. It was better. It was a life born from loss, nurtured by resilience, and flourished through choice. I stepped into the house, taking in the warmth of the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread, the sound of life moving around me. This was home. This was freedom. This was strength. And as I looked out over the fields once more, I understood that beginnings could arrive even after endings, and that the greatest victories are often born not from circumstance, but from the courage to rise, to rebuild, and to claim the life you were always meant to live. My story had been shattered, abandoned, and tested, but now it was mine entirely. And in that ownership, I found peace, joy, and a beginning that was more beautiful than I had ever imagined. The sun rose gently over the countryside that morning, painting the fields in gold and amber. I stood on the porch, tea in hand, and watched the light stretch across the land I had rebuilt, the life I had nurtured from nothing. It struck me that life, in all its unpredictability, has a way of teaching the lessons we need most, not always gently, and rarely in the way we expect. My journey had begun with grief, betrayal, and abandonment, but it had ended with clarity, strength, and choice. And perhaps the most important lesson of all was that survival is not the same as living. Resilience is not the same as strength. And love, though essential, does not require surrender. For years, I had defined myself through the people I loved and lost. My husband's death had hollowed me out in ways I could never have imagined. His absence created a void that I thought only my daughter's presence could fill. I expected her to anchor me, to be my support, to help me navigate the silence. Instead, she left, and in that departure, she forced me into a truth I had never confronted. That life does not pause for grief, that dependence can leave us vulnerable, and that strength often emerges only when we are pushed to the edge. At first, the abandonment felt like betrayal. I had built my life around her presence, believing that family was an unbreakable bond. But grief has a way of sharpening perception. In the quiet, I began to see the cracks, the ways my daughter had always struggled with empathy, the ways she had prioritized convenience over care. And slowly, through nights of tearful solitude and days of quiet labor, I realized something radical. I did not need her to survive. I did not need anyone. I could live and even thrive on my own. The first steps toward that independence were terrifying. Alone in the house she had left me in, I was forced to confront my own vulnerability. Every task, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the property, felt monumental at first. But with each small success, a seed of confidence began to grow. The garden became my teacher, the soil my companion, the work my meditation. Life had been stripped to its essentials, and in that stripped-down existence, I discovered my capacity. I learned patience, resilience, and the quiet joy of building something with my own hands. The community around me played a role too. Neighbors who had been distant observers began to engage with me, offering advice, small help, and eventually friendship. Margaret, my steadfast friend, became a lifeline, reminding me that connection is not only about family. It is about shared humanity, mutual respect, and the courage to reach out, even when it feels impossible. In these relationships, I found the support I had thought I would only find in my daughter's presence. And then, when my daughter returned, the true test of strength presented itself. She came back expecting weakness, expecting dependence, expecting that the woman she had abandoned would still orbit around her needs. What she found instead was someone she barely recognized, independent, grounded, and calm. She saw, finally, that leaving me behind had not destroyed me. It had allowed me to grow in ways she could not have imagined. The shock she experienced upon realizing my strength was profound. Not only was I capable without her, I was thriving. I had rebuilt a home, cultivated the land, earned respect from the community, and established financial and emotional independence. She confronted a reality she had never anticipated. Abandoning someone does not erase their existence, nor does it prevent growth. Her miscalculation had given me the most valuable gift of all, the chance to reclaim my life entirely. When we began to rebuild our relationship, it was not easy. There were boundaries, honest conversations, and careful steps. She had to learn that forgiveness is not entitlement, and love is not permission to assume. I had to learn that reconciliation does not require erasing the past. We moved slowly, sometimes clumsily, but with intention and respect. And through this process, a new kind of bond emerged, one grounded not in expectation, but in choice, understanding, and mutual acknowledgement of each other's humanity. The moral of my story, if it can be distilled into words, is this. The true measure of life is not found in who stays with you, but in how you respond when they leave. Strength is forged in absence. Resilience blooms in isolation, and dignity is reclaimed through choice. We cannot control the actions of others, but we can control how we shape our own lives in response. My daughter's abandonment was a wound, but it was also a catalyst. Without her departure, I may never have discovered the depth of my own courage, the scope of my own capability, or the richness of a life built independently. Life does not always give us the comfort of predictability. Loss comes without warning. Betrayal can come from the closest hearts. And plans we imagine may crumble in a single moment. But these challenges, painful as they are, contain within them the seeds of transformation. We can choose to succumb to despair, or we can rise, carefully, deliberately, and claim the life that is still possible. For me, the countryside became a sanctuary, not because it was quiet, but because it was honest. It revealed my weaknesses and forced me to confront them. It revealed my strengths, often when I didn't recognize them myself. And it became a home not only for my survival, but for my flourishing. And so my life, once defined by loss and abandonment, is now defined by choice, resilience, and growth. I have learned that love is most powerful when balanced with boundaries, that forgiveness is valuable when paired with understanding, and that the human spirit can endure far more than we often believe. I look out over the fields now, fully aware that my husband is gone, that my daughter once left me, and that challenges will continue to arise. And yet, I do not fear them. I am no longer the woman who waited for others to rescue her. I am the woman who faced the silence, the emptiness, the betrayal, and turned them into a life that is vibrant, meaningful, and wholly mine. To anyone who feels abandoned, overlooked, or left behind, the world may turn away from you, and the people you love may falter. But your life does not have to end there. Strength is born in solitude. Growth is born in adversity. And the most profound beginnings often emerge from the endings we fear most. My story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of choice, and the possibility of renewal. Abandonment did not define me. Betrayal did not break me. Loss did not end me. And now, as I step fully into this new beginning, I understand at last that the life we are given is only the starting point. The life we build in courage and clarity is the true measure of our existence. I am no longer defined by absence, loss, or the mistakes of others. I am defined by the life I have claimed, the strength I have discovered, and the peace I have earned. And in that truth I have found not only survival, but freedom, joy, and the beauty of a new beginning.